Welcome back, everybody. If you could please take your seats, I'd like to invite David Whitehouse to the front. Now we'll begin session 3, which will feature a panel discussion about energy transition trade-offs and another discussion about carbon capture and storage. But first, we'll start with a conversation with David Whitehouse about tackling Europe's energy crisis and the energy transition. Thank you, David.
Hi.
Hi. So, David, just to let everybody else know just a bit about you, but I encourage you all to check in the app all the biographies of our wonderful lineup of speakers there for you. But David is CEO of Offshore Energies UK. He has 30 years of experience in oil and gas and a chemistry master's and a PhD in theoretical chemistry.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, and I understand you're undergoing a transition of your own right now, so to speak, after decades of experience in oil and gas, going to the University of Aberdeen and pursuing another degree, a master's this time in renewable engineering.
I am actually. So the organisation I represent, so my heritage is oil and gas, and we represent over 400 companies who are investing in oil and gas, but actually oil and gas, CCUS, hydrogen, wind across the UK is what we represent. And yeah, so I've been lucky enough to go back to university. I think I'm the second oldest person at Aberdeen University, so there's one other person who's older than me. It has been, and the main reason I've always loved my job is actually, I pretend to be an engineer, but I love the stuff that we do. I love the stuff we build. And I thought going back to university, just that fantastic opportunity to learn actually more about the technology, it's been great. For those of you who'd like to do it, Aberdeen is ranked 4th best in the UK for student satisfaction, if you're interested. But actually what's been the best thing for me about going back, if I'm honest, is one is that opportunity to actually have some time to think. But you actually get to work with young people. And one of the things actually we haven't really touched on yet today is all this fantastic energy around the transition. You cannot do it without people. And it's been great to go back to university and actually talk with and actually work with young people. Unfortunately, they treat me like I'm their granddad, but it's okay. So go back and work with young people. And then the other thing that has been fantastic is I have worked around the world, but the last 20 years worked in the North Sea. Sometimes you get in your own little bubble. And one of the things, again, about going back to university is that opportunity. I now work, I study alongside kids, really, from across the world. And sometimes we live in our own little bubble. And so I'm working alongside people whose parents have mortgaged their homes to allow them to be there. It shows how great our education system is. I work alongside people who, well, I'm sure we'll get into it. We have a debate about oil and gas, and is it oil and gas versus, or is it oil and gas and all that stuff. But actually, I work alongside people actually who don't have access to energy. And this whole thing is you cannot have a dignified life without energy. And sometimes in our UK bubble, I think we sometimes forget about that. People need energy, and it's really interesting. And actually, it's been a real privilege working alongside some really great overseas students, actually. Sorry.
Great, thanks. So Aberdeen, actually, I was just there recently for a big industry event. And it's an interesting place, and there's so much port infrastructure, and just it's a real working city. And but it's trying to make a transition to be the energy transition sort of hub for the UK and even beyond. So what actually needs to happen to catalyze that, and milestones? What do you think? How does that look? Maybe by 2030 and by 2050.
By 2050. Yeah. So again, I come from the oil and gas sector is a couple 100,000 people. So actually, I think it's not just Aberdeen that wants to sit in that place. We talk about it being the energy capital of Europe. I think other cities probably try and get the same name. And we want that to be the same. We want that to be true, not just now, but in the future. And actually, we want the UK and Scotland to be the energy capital of Europe. We've been very lucky. In my opinion, the North Sea has powered the UK for the last 50 years. And I think if we get the transition right, then we'll power the UK for the next 50 years and beyond. And actually, more and more, what is also very clear, this is all about integration with Europe, quite frankly, as well. So the North Sea is one of the greatest assets that Europe has. And actually, if we get this right, we'll drive that. And so what does that mean by 2030? Well, kind of people like me would say this. I think it's about, often you hear, if you come from an oil and gas heritage, then to some degree you're excluded from the conversation about energy transition. Trust me, you know, I care as much about the environment as anybody. I have kids, and so do the 200,000 people who work in my sector. So by 2030, what you want is less of this them and us, more about working together, more about recognizing that actually the skills, we're so lucky in the UK, we have the skills, we have the people, we have the universities, we have the feedstock, we've got the carbon stores, we've got the wind, which we complain about sometimes, but is absolutely there for us. We got tidal, so the opportunity is there. And by 2030, what does that mean? I think you want to see is the UK is absolutely on that path where we've spoken a lot today about opportunities in the transition. In my view today, I have never seen as many projects effectively in that pre-FID phase in my life. And that's, we're talking about wind, we talk about carbon storage, we talk about hydrogen, talk about oil and gas, quite frankly. You want to see that unblocked and actually delivering on our targets, which is oil and gas playing its part, so decarbonizing our production. So we have targets that we will meet, which means the emissions from oil and gas in the UK will be halved by the decade. But more importantly, we'll be injecting 30 million tons of carbon, and we will together deliver on kind of our wind ambition and start to absolutely transform the UK economy.
And so by 2050 then, when everyone's declared that they'll be net zero, what would that look like? I mean, what do you think the right balance at that stage would be for oil versus offshore wind in cities like Aberdeen?
So I think you're already seeing it. It has to be a transition, and you know, it was interesting listening. I really enjoyed the professor this morning. I don't agree with every view, but I think that debate is good. UK, we still 75% of our energy is oil and gas, so there is a role for oil and gas, and I think most projections would say even by 2050 there will still be a need for oil and gas in some way, shape, or form to meet some of our energy needs. So the Committee on Climate Change would say that, but clearly abated oil and gas. So by 2050, I think there is still a role, but quite clearly a very diminishing role. And I think by 2050, what you will see is energy becoming much, much more integrated. We work with over 400 supply chain companies already. Most of those companies, yes, they use their revenue from oil and gas to generate profits, but they're using that to invest in renewables and invest in alternative technology. So I think you're going to see that more and more becoming more and more integrated by 2030 and then by 2050. And if I could say, our long-term goals are important. 2050 is an important date, but actually hitting our short-term goals is, I think, where we really do need to focus. I think it's too easy to talk about 2050 targets and lose sight of what needs to be done in the course of the next 7 years.
Absolutely. The 200,000 people in the UK oil and gas sector today, as you mentioned, just what happens to them? Because, I mean, what needs to happen now in order for them to have what people refer to as a just transition?
So I guess a couple of things. You've got 200,000 really decent people who currently support the sector. There's lots of studies out there that show how transferable the skills are between our current oil and gas sector and as we step through a transition, actually working in other areas. So what needs to happen to them? Well, one is, I think we need to recognizing that. Tomorrow, I've got the opportunity, I'm attending a discussion. We work very closely with Renewables UK, so wind developers in the oil and gas that is required in this energy transition. And if we get this right, the 200,000 people we currently have working in the sector, should be 300, should be 400,000 as we step forward. It should be creating good quality jobs up and down the country. And one of the things, again, from my perspective, which I think needs to consistently be said, the IEA has some views about how we transition, which are good and well worth listening to. But what the IEA is also very clear on, if you want a successful energy transition, it needs to be done with people, not to people. And far too often, I think you have people talking down to those who work in various sectors. We will not be successful if we go about our business in that way. We need to work with people, and I think those 200,000 people are really important. I've worked in the sector for a long time. Proud of proud of kind of the innovation, the drive. If you've worked in the North Sea, it's a real badge of honor around the world, and we shouldn't underestimate what an incredible export that has been. And it's been an incredible export for 50 years. It will be an incredible export for the next 50 years as well, I believe, and we need to make sure we get that right. Those who work in the sector, we don't like this talk of being left behind like the miners. We have complete sympathy. And the reason we're not, if you actually come and work with those who work in the energy sector, often you sit in these conversations, and I'm not sure people have necessarily spent enough time with those who actually work in the sector. And I'm talking about the technicians, the sparkies, all the people who actually really work in the sector. They're way ahead of some of the conversations that people have about integration and about the transition. And we need to recognize that a lot more. This energy transition needs to be done with people, not to them.
Thank you. That brings me to something else. It's just looking at where we are today. There are a lot of people prepared to get in your way. Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, any number of pressure groups and environmental groups who are very, very passionate about what they're doing. And we've seen it, they're prepared to do everything from, disrupting Wimbledon to I mentioned earlier, oil industry events and things like that. And they're talking about just leave it in the ground and not about, produce more oil and gas in the short term to meet the energy security needs because of the war. They're not willing to compromise on that. And so what do you think about their tactics and about their, how do you find common ground with the groups that are out there really at the forefront of advocating for a faster energy transition?
I think the thing for me, actually, to be honest, I think if people have energy and a desire, then actually I'm okay with that. I think it's okay. So some of the tactics, no, I would disagree with. But generally speaking, for people to have energy around this issue, to drive it, I think that's okay with me. I've been at a number of events where people have protested actually about me speaking. But I respect that. The energy is good. I disagree. I think today, if we choose not to invest, we had a conversation this morning about do you invest in more. So in the UK, 75% of our energy is oil and gas. We produce about half of it. Absolutely. During this transition, I think we should, as long as the industry is doing the right thing, which is decarbonizing its own production and using, through its supply chain and others, is investing in the transition, then in my view, of course, you should continue to invest in domestic oil and gas. It's lower emissions, it's jobs. We need the jobs. And yes, actually, when you see what's happening in the world, I think it is important to look at energy security on a UK, but quite frankly, a European stage. But can you get common ground with people? Again, actually, today's a good event. The more you have the debate, in my view, the more you realize you actually all want the same thing. And yes, you'll debate about how to get there. But yeah, I tell you what, the companies that I represent, yes, everyone wants to be net zero by 2050. Everyone wants to meet those targets by 2030. Yeah? We're all on the same page. And actually, the more you talk about how do you get there and you have that conversation, I think you can get some common ground.
Great, thanks. And then just, we're starting to run short on time, but I wanted to ask you about, the messaging definitely has changed since the war, and from a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy to within the industry, oil and gas companies talking about and, not or. And I just wonder, with that, if we continue to invest in new long-term oil and gas field developments and infrastructure, how is that transitioning away from fossil fuels to clean energy sources to address climate change? And where do you stand on the and, not or?
Yeah, so I guess I'm sure there's plenty in the room who disagree with the and, not or piece. In my view, it's this piece where I see this as an energy transition. I recognize that sometimes we speak as if we can turn on renewable energy and it'll be there tomorrow. And the truth is it won't, and we all know that. And the truth is actually what we've spoken about today and got touched onto is How do you unlock it so that happens at speed? And I think the organizations that I represent, we see no conflict with actually move that transition forward as fast as you can. We see no conflict with that whatsoever. But the reason why we say and, or the reason why I would support and, is because during this transition, while we've got 1 million more homes today using gas for heating than we had a year ago. We've got 24 million homes. It will take time and it will take money to change that. We've got 30 million cars on the road that we need to change. We're still getting 40% of our electricity from and I think you have to deal with the reality of what is true today, not the reality of what you would like it to be. And because of that, you need an and. You need a transition period where you actually work. Oil and gas in the North Sea will decline. It will. Of course it will, and it'll be right that it declines over time. But while we need it, while we push that transition, I think it's important that there's an and we need to put as much energy into addressing our energy generation. We need to put that same energy into decarbonising our country, and there's some difficult things that we need to tackle there.
Great, thank you. And lastly, what is OE UK doing to prepare for the next UK election to try to ensure some stability for energy policy, even if the party in power doesn't remain in power?
The same conversation we're having here. So again, I was lucky enough. I've attended the various political conferences this autumn. And although there is differences, although there is debate, there is, in my opinion, there has always been a very solid consensus in the UK that we need in the right way to deal with the energy transition. We need to deliver on our climate goals. I think we do need to do that by bringing people with us. And so there's some issues there. I think we have more work to do in that space. We haven't spoken about it, but one of the issues about the grid is actually we need to take communities with us, that they're prepared to accept that we need to have 2 or 3 times the size of grid across the country, and we need to take people with us. So what are we doing? We're having those same conversations that we're having here. And what again, although people will disagree with me, there is a huge consensus that sits in the middle about, yes, we need to deliver and we need to do it in a pragmatic way. And although the parties have different points on this, you still find that consensus. And for me, it remains incredibly important that the UK doesn't lose that consensus that we need to deliver on our climate goals.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you, David. And thanks, audience. Please show your appreciation.
Thank you very much.
So next, I'd like to welcome Andrew Lee back to the stage for our next discussion about energy transition trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, so it's time for our next panel. Trade-offs and synergies between energy security and fighting climate change. And I've got a good panel to welcome on stage. If they'd like to come up, we've got Daniel Fitzgerald, who's the CEO of Oren Energy, Mike Hemsley, who's the Deputy Director of the Energy Transitions Commission, Dr. Paul Ebbert, who's the Group Director, Sustainability and Energy Transition for Worley, and Al-Karim Govinji, who's the Global Head of Public Affairs for Energy Systems at DNV. Welcome, everyone. Please take a seat. Thank you. I think we heard in the last few minutes, this touched upon, and we've heard a lot more about energy security since the start of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I think 2 narratives have emerged. And the first one says that nations and blocs like the EU are realizing that they've relied far too heavily on limited sources of supply for their energy needs, and that's going to make them move faster towards renewables. And so Exhibit A in that respect might be the various EU packages we've seen in the last 18 months or so. And then the second narrative says, well, energy security is actually going to make people look again at their fossil reserves. And Exhibit B would be the UK's decision to license new activity in the North Sea. So we've got potentially a conflict, but we've also potentially got some synergies. So let's start with what do we mean by energy security? I mean, I think most of us here realise what the key ingredients are in the fight against climate change, but what does energy security actually mean? I'm just going to ask the panel to start with for a quick few words of what they think defines energy security. So I'm going to start here with Daniel.
Yeah, I think energy is such a core part of our society. It's in people's homes, it's in our economy, it drives everything we do. So I think the two elements, not just energy security, but price of energy and affordability of energy, both of those are really important. And Europe, at the end of 2022, went through periods where Germany, we were talking about rolling blackouts in Germany and Switzerland for a lack of gas. So we have to solve that energy supply and security side, but we can't afford what we saw at the end of 2022 with the pricing, because that also puts us in a place where people are feeling insecure about the energy that they're using as well. So for me, we have to solve that problem, and I don't think it's only renewables. I think we've heard a lot of discussions today around, and if we turn off the oil and gas, then we don't have renewables to power our society today. So it's a matter of all of it until we transition out.
So it's access to supplies, but at a price that people can afford.
Yeah, I think, and the cost and affordability of energy is just as important as the security. Because if we forecast pricing like the end of 2022 into the next 4 or 5 years, the fabric of our society is going to fall apart. So it's not just the supply. I think pricing is a very big important part of that.
Okay. Mike, from the Energy Transitions Commission's point of view and from your own point of view, what's your thought? What is energy security?
I mean, I think I mostly agree with that. People want energy services delivered at all times, but that alone isn't the definition, because it has to be at the right cost as well, because otherwise that becomes the big political discussion around this. I think what's also kind of implicit in that definition is that you need energy systems which have a certain level of extra capacity and resilience in it, because otherwise you can't deliver it securely or at low cost. That might be a capacity market in power sector or gas storage in the gas system, something like that. And I think also what's implied by some with the definition of energy security is an acceptable level of import dependence too. So you're not reliant on certain parties for certain fossil fuel contracts or even renewable supply, things like that.
Okay. Paul, your thoughts on energy security?
I have a more macro view, actually. I think what we've seen in Europe with Ukraine, what we're likely to see with what's panning out in Israel and Gaza, I think energy security is ultimately about sustainability. So sustainability is a trilemma. It's financial, so getting the right price. It's social, because I agree with other speakers that it's integral to who we are as a society, and it's integral to our standard of living. It's just so important to who we are. But there's the third element of environment, and I think it's that balancing act which ultimately is all about the level of energy security. So that's what it is to me.
And now, Karim, what's your view on this? Energy security?
Yeah, I mean, energy security, I guess, traditionally is thought of as the availability of sufficient fuels at an affordable price, and then we've added sustainability to that definition in the last years. And I think it's interesting that sometimes energy security now can be replaced, or is being replaced in some places, by the term of protectionism, right? Because I think when we've seen around some of the policies around the world, that notion of trying to create and generate that energy that you need as a nation, and the restrictions that are applied to others to supply that energy is seen as protectionism. But I think energy security, can also be viewed as the physical and the cyber security of the energy assets that we have, right? So it's a slightly different terminology, but a very important one, I think, is particularly as we see some of the things that we see around the world, but also some of the attacks on the Colonial Pipeline we saw in the US, Nord Stream, of course, the Finnish pipeline a week ago. So those, the ability of nation states and NATO and other kind of security forces to protect those assets physically as well as from a cyber threats, I think is an important part of the equation. But I think I like your definition, or the element you added, which is the just transition bit. Because which is really about access to energy. Some countries don't even have, many countries in the world, and people don't have access to energy at all, at any price, right? There's no grids, there's no power. So I think we do need to broaden that definition to make sure that North and South global definition of energy security is considered.
Yeah, I think we've got some great insights there into what we might mean by energy security. Whatever we mean by it, it's a term that's gained a lot of currency as I say, in the last few years. Has it helped us? Has this focus on energy security helped us in the push for decarbonisation, or has it hindered us, or is it doing both? Is this something that's assisted the push towards net zero? Back to you, Daniel. What do you think?
I think the train's left the station on net zero. We're going there. So there's no question that we need to decarbonize our energy systems. So whether that's through oil and gas, nuclear, renewables, or all of them, we're on this journey, and that's on its way. I think if I roll back economically and policy to some extent, we go back pre-Ukraine war, then we had a pace on the energy transition, but it wasn't massive pace. What happened in 2022 has pushed the energy price through the roof. It's pushed security to the forefront, and I think we took some really big steps towards the energy transition, which was positive. But then we come into 2023, and we've seen gas storages full on the back of what happened at the end of 2022 across Europe. We've seen pricing through the summer really drop off. And now we're starting to see the economics or the economic impact of a really low price or instability in that price hitting offshore wind. We see what happened with Ørsted and others in the US. We saw the recent bids into offshore wind in the UK. We're seeing that scale back a bit in Germany. So this instability in the economic framework around renewables doesn't help us get to the end of the transition. So for me, what happened in 2022 around Ukraine has really opened the door on energy security and cost of energy. But I think we need stable conditions going forwards for companies to invest in the transition and to see a roadmap that can allow them to get all the way through this.
Okay. Mike, do you think we've had it's been a help or a hindrance, energy security push?
I think it risks being a little bit of a distraction. I think, to your point, Daniel, when we look at the energy transition, we see that it's firmly underway in all the big emitters in the world. In China, 40% of all vehicles solar electric. They build half of all the world's renewables every year. They build 150 gigawatt plus. US, they've got the Inflation Reduction Act. Renewables are booming. EVs are booming. Europe, very heartened by the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and kind of doubling down on renewables as the kind of energy security strategy. But I think there's a risk of what's kind of put behind the term energy security sometimes as being implicitly we need lots of mass scale development of new oil and gas, and that's just fundamentally not true. I think that what we see when we actually look at the numbers on this is that the trends that you've got in those markets that I mentioned, and by the way, I forgot India, but India is a laggard, but still within that grouping, it is that you're having a shift away from fossil fuels already. You know, we've already peaked coal use globally, and we're definitively going to peak oil and gas use this decade because of the trends already baked in place, because the EU and the US will have a fully decarbonized power sector by the mid-2030s, because they'll have 100% of vehicles sold being electric by 2030, as will China. So I think there's a risk that energy security is kind of used as a fig leaf for massive new investment in oil and gas. Yeah. And what we try and do within our organization is insert the right facts into that debate, right? And I think that there are legitimate reasons why you need some new, very limited investment in oil and gas, because we can be clear, if you turn it off tomorrow, that's not energy security either. But there's a risk that it's used to justify loads of mass-scale new investment that we just don't need, because when you look at the trends, we're driving away from it gradually in the 2020s, but then fundamentally beyond then. And there's a risk that all of that basically becomes stranded.
Sure, yeah. Paul, help or hindrance to the net zero push?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my position would be ultimately it's been a help, and I think there's been a number of shocks over the last few years. And this has certainly put a blowtorch on things like diversification. I can only comment on what we've seen as a business, and certainly as a business we've seen a big ramp up in what we would call the sustainability spectrum. So is it coincidence that just happened with these events? I don't think so. I think there is a link there. So I do agree, though, that I think there are some short-term hindrances, and I think there's some other issues emerging which we can talk about later. But yeah, I think it's been a help.
Okay. And Karim, your view on this?
Yeah, I guess a bit of both. I mean, if you look short term, one might say that there's a tendency for nation states to want to self-generate their energy supply rather than rely on imports. And some of the modelling we've done indicates that nation states are willing to pay a premium of 6 to 15% to secure, and in some cases even more, to secure that supply. Hence, nuclear is back on the agenda, etc. So I think there's that issue, but the issue with friendshoring or nearshoring, as one might term it, is that you compound some of the costs of these assets, right? By having to manufacture yourself, you're creating new supply chains that take time, number one, cost you much more money than using what's already in existence. And add to that the inflationary pressures that are already there, the supply chain challenges that are already there, the higher cost of capital that we've seen from 100 basis points to 400 basis points in the last year or so, means that actually this notion tends to slow down the transition in the short term, but also make it much more costly. In the longer term, though, you might say that the two, sustainability and security, go hand in hand, because access to wind, solar, and batteries secure and shield countries from the volatility of fossil prices in the markets, right? So that's a kind of positive thing for countries to look at. But remember, all these countries were required in Glasgow to resubmit their nationally determined contributions by 2022. 70-odd countries have done that. And according to the IEA's assessment of those NDCs, we are not aligned with the Paris future.
Yeah.
So I think there is a bit of tension on whether we are in some places moving in the right direction, but perhaps in a lot of places we're not.
Okay, I mean, it's a good, and I would say to the audience, please feel free, if you'd like to submit your questions via the app, please do, and if we've got time, we'll certainly try and get to them. You've mentioned the Paris imperative, and obviously we're on the eve of COP, another COP, and DNV is obviously very closely monitoring progress in all sorts of areas. So I wanted to ask you, you're one of those organisations that produces major pieces of work every year, and in the run-up to the COP summits, about just quickly how you see things, for as we lead into this summit, and possibly whether you think this issue of energy security is going to play into the table at the UAE in any way. Yeah,
I mean, we produce this energy transition outlook every year, which is a single most likely forecast. It's not scenario-based. And in that, we forecast that we will exhaust 1.5 degrees by 2029. We will hit 2 degrees by 2054, and by 21 we'll be at 2.2 degrees. And emissions currently around 33 gigatons annually today, after CCS, will go to around 18 gigatons by 2050. So the halving of what is being called for globally of emissions from now to 2030 will only get to 46% reductions by 2050, and at 2030 will only be at 4% reduction. So that's a bit of a problematic situation as you come to COP and you see things are actually way off track from that perspective. If you look at sort of the mix between fossil and non-fossil, currently today it's around 80% fossil, 20% non-fossil. And in 2050, most likely will be around 48% fossil, 52% non-fossil. So moving in the right direction, but it's clearly not enough to eradicate that 18 gigatons that are still left in 2050. So I think there are some challenges when we come to COP, and some big decisions need to be made in order for that to alter.
Do you think the policymakers are in the right frame of mind to make those big decisions at the moment. Given the world situation, previous COPs, you've arguably had a more benign environment than possibly we have now. Because of some of the issues we've touched upon, I mean, are they in the right place to make these?
I think it's certainly a challenge, and global events don't help to get people's mind frame in the right place because they're considering other things and other issues. But I'd say there have been some supercharging of policies that we've seen in the last couple of years, right? So we've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, seen 280 billion of private sector funding being committed in the last 15 months on the back of the incentives that are being offered through those tax credits. And the various EU policies around the Net Zero Industrial Act and the Green Deal and all the rest of it is nudging the EU actually very close to a net zero by 2050 in our most likely scenario. So I think there are regions that are in the right place. The question is, in order to achieve 1.5, you actually need a lot of these regions to go much, much faster than that. You need China to get to net zero by 2050. You need India to get there by 2060, not the 2070 that they've actually put in right now, and China have said 2060. EU and North America, for example, need to get to net zero by 2042. So, you know, to compensate for those markets which can't get there, you need other markets to go much, much quicker.
Mike, I'm going to ask you, you know, the ETC is a big tent organisation. You look at these issues very closely as well in the run-up to climate summits. I'm going to ask you the same question. You know, where do you see us as we approach COP28, and you know, is this going to cloud the judgment or cloud the decisions that are made by the policymakers in the UAE? Are you optimistic?
Optimistic is probably not the right word, but I'm hoping that we can continue to build on the kind of pragmatic progress that we've been introducing over the last couple of years. I think fundamentally I agree with Al-Karim's assessment that the 1.5 goal starts to look increasingly challenging, and I don't think anyone should be looking at this COP you know, for anything really big, new and dramatic which is going to change that, because a lot of countries' plans are already baked in. But what I think they will do at COP is ask people to commit to new initiatives which will reinforce and accelerate some of the trends we're already seeing. So I think committing to tripling renewables by 2030, and I think that's something that, as a policymaker, even if you are distracted, you can quite easily commit to, because it's a global commitment. It doesn't necessarily affect your country, and it's basically an acceleration of current market trends. So those kind of things are quite easy, but you know, make a massive difference. That reduces fossil fuel in the power sector from over 60% today to less than 40% by 2030. So those kind of things are really, really material. I think what will also be a focus, though, given the hosts, is fossil fuels. And I think it's the first time, really, we've seen fossil fuels as a topic of consideration at COP, and the ETC is publishing a report on fossil fuels ahead of COP, actually, to try and be of influence there. And I think you've got some kind of proposals put forward from the fossil fuel industry and from the COP presidents, which are positive on fossil fuels. One is a commitment to the inevitable phase down of all fossil fuels by mid-century. That's literally what the COP president has written to parties to ask for.
Yeah.
That would be material. But that's quite a long-term goal. The nearer-term goal is more focused on reducing production emissions with fossil fuels. Some companies do that really, really well. Some countries do that really, really well. But it's a selection within a large group, and we'd love to see that expanded to a wider group. Those two things would be quite material, actually, if they were agreed. The acknowledgement that, you know, this is an industry in transition and is ultimately phasing down. I think we'd love to see that come out of the overall COP declaration. Some of the country and company plans land there. The question is whether that's enough, and how much that may then contradict current fossil fuel strategies, which see a massive stated increase in oil and gas extraction over the next decade, which would contradict that long-term goal.
Well, this is the key, isn't it? I think you know, we've heard this debate quite a lot today. This is the key. There's such a stark contrast between the position at one end, which maybe is taken by the protesters who were outside the Park Lane Hotel the other week, and possibly also by the IEA. You know, this needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. And that's the only thing that's going to really move the dial to where we need to go. And then there's the position that says, well, really that's just not feasible. We need a much more pragmatic approach. But it seems to me the more pragmatic approach is unlikely to bring the blockbuster moment that gets us from, to 1.5, for example, which we've all said needs a big shift. And I think, isn't this where we're stuck now with the energy transition? We're stuck in this dilemma of needing to move the dial, but not really practically being able to.
To some extent, we are, and you're looking at incremental changes being agreed at some of these things, like the COPs. But there are still big wins to be had, right? If you get the majority of big fossil fuel producing countries to commit to low methane or reduced flaring, the total of that is something like 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's a massive prize up for grabs. Deforestation, again, another one that you can be talking about there. But I think we are reduced a little bit to incremental change. But I think what's going on in the background is some of the trends that we've talked about already, and that the energy transition so far has kind of unlocked this unstoppable beast in terms of renewable progress, battery progress, electric vehicle progress. And anybody who doubts that that's going to continue is just fundamentally wrong, I think. I think what it doesn't do is dramatically change emissions this decade, just because even though it's an increased percentage of sales of electric vehicles, it doesn't change the stock that much. But what it does is really open up the possibilities for rapid progress beyond this decade, where solar will be the cheapest energy technology we've ever seen, available in abundance. Same with electric vehicles, same with those kind of things.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Paul, Worley is a global player, and you deal with customers around the world, you deal with big projects, you deal with big ambitions. I mean, give us a snapshot. You've touched on it slightly already, but just give us a snapshot of what you're seeing from your customers at the moment as they make decisions now about investments that will maybe come to fruition in 5 years. Firstly, have you seen any reduction in momentum of the imperative towards the energy transition, and has this new dynamic of the fossil fuel industry shifted the dial at all?
Firstly, I won't be talking about customers specifically. You'd
No, of course.
probably like me to. Look, I have a global role, so I'm not an expert on European or UK policy, even though I'm based in London. The simple fact is the transition is not happening fast enough. We know that. But I think we have to step back a step and say what it is we're trying to achieve here. This is an unbelievable transformation that's required. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up that there are issues, there are roadblocks that do slow things down. With our customers, it's a mixture of speeding up and slowing down. But there are a couple of things that worry me at the moment. One of them is the political situation and changes in policy. We've seen that in the UK. We're seeing green-leaning governments in countries like Switzerland, Germany, under a bit of pressure. And I think what's behind that is the cost of energy and the whole cost of living crisis. I do worry about what might happen in the US. There's another election coming up soon. That sort of instability is not good news for energy transition. A really big one that worries me is climate is not necessarily front and centre for everyone. I don't think we have social licence for decarbonisation, particularly in communities impacted by infrastructure. We're an infrastructure company. We see this more and more. Social contract has got to get a lot of attention. And the scale and speed of infrastructure development for net zero is enormous. It's like nothing the world has ever seen before. And the last one I'll just mention is the practical issues getting in front of getting projects to financial close. So the mobilisation of capital is proving difficult. Our customers are having difficulty getting their projects to financial close. The value proposition is hard for them to justify in many aspects. And there's a whole bunch of things behind that. There's the cost of capital. There's also technology risk in some areas, permitting in regulatory timeframes, supply chain processes, and the inability to get that financial return that they really need for their shareholders. I think we're very close to some big companies reneging on their ambitions, their 2030 ambitions, and I'm very curious to see what that will do to the net zero and decarbonisation debate. So one reason that that's important is that mandatory reporting is coming. And I think that's going to put the blowtorch on a lot of ambitions that have been publicly stated. So, these things are decelerating energy transition. But personally, by and large, I'm very positive about the pace of energy transition. Very hopeful that we can actually get there. I agree with Mike. I think what we've got to do is construct what I call the enablement mechanisms by 2030. So, it's easy to criticise some of these big projects that are finding it difficult to get over the line. We did a bit of work with Princeton, which we published last month, which looked at the hydrogen ambition in Europe, and we basically concluded that it won't be met. And it won't be met because you simply can't move the capital fast enough. There's a whole bunch of things in the way that delay that process, and we have to speed that process up. So I actually agree with, was it Professor Elkins this morning? It is all about getting that capital discipline process to accelerate. If we want to tackle climate, that's what we've got to do.
I was interested you mentioned the US election as something that's on the horizon. I mean, I think the US has been, in the last few years, very much a leader with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think we've seen lots of evidence that all political areas of Republican and Democrat voters have all benefited from the transition in terms of investment. The fact you're concerned says to me that maybe the transition is a bit fragile still. Maybe these things aren't as embedded as we hope. Even a factory in your town or in your state won't cement it as much as we'd like. Is it still a bit fragile?
There are customers of ours who won't go for IRA or bipartisan infrastructure funds because of the policy risk. So they see it as too risky to the types and scale of investment that they've got in front of them. That's limited, but there are customers who see it that way. So that would be saying, yes, they see that as a bit fragile. Personally, I think what's happening in the US is actually very good. It is certainly supercharging our energy transition business in the US with some really important players. There's been a lot said about oil and gas players. We do a lot of work with them. And COP28. I think an outcome from COP28, which is all relevant to this, is actually what is the role of the oil and gas industry. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. We think they're absolutely mandatory to have at the table. And the primary reason for that is they do something very well. They allocate and mobilise and deal with large chunks of capital. And they do it very well. And they have the human resources that we're going to need. So there's an outcome from COP28, all relevant to this, which I think is what is the role of the oil and gas industry. I'd love to see that come out of COP28.
Yeah, okay, that's great, thank you. Daniel, Oren Energy, which you lead, is in many ways the energy transition in action, in that you have come from the oil and gas industry and you've emerged as a player in renewables. And you're at the moment you're developing and financing and advancing renewables projects. Give us a sense of how the last 18 months and the changes we've talked about it a bit in the context of offshore wind already. How that's changed the landscape for you as a renewables developer when you're out actually trying to finance your projects, get them consented? Have you seen a change? Have you seen things get harder? And if so, how? And what's your prognosis for the future?
Yeah, I think it's interesting sitting on the other side, completely the other side of the debate from the policy side. So we sat as a fairly large oil and gas player. We would have been carbon neutral on scope 1 and 2 emissions by the end of this year. So it's absolutely possible, and I think your comments around getting them at the table, we have to have oil and gas at the table, because if we stop it tomorrow, our whole society is going to fall apart. And there's so many parts of the world that don't have access to energy. And who are we to say you should have green energy as opposed to no energy versus energy first, and then you should do it in, like you touched on, the most sustainable way we can. So that place as an oil and gas player at the table is really important, because the front end of the energy transition is oil and gas, and the back end is all the renewables and everything else, and we have to transition through that. For me, on the oil and gas side, we looked at a whole range of things before we ultimately sold the company, and one of those was to pivot completely into renewables. So to take all of the oil and gas revenues and invest 100% into renewables. And when we do that, we start to hit some of the challenges on the other side of policy, where to take $1 out of oil and gas and put it into renewables versus $1 out of oil and gas into oil and gas, the return framework is fundamentally different, and we could never make that decision to invest in renewables. And to take the entire company and put it to renewables also didn't work economically when we touch on the shareholder debate, because a return framework in renewables just doesn't match. Now that'll change over time. When we get through peak oil and gas, I think we move to a world where that premise is fundamentally different. But for the next 10 years, and when we look at the DNV report or any of the reports coming out on the energy transition, we're going to take longer than what we've said we're going to take. So for the next 10 or 15 years, what we're unfortunately going to see, I think, is the oil and gas is going to drive the front end of that, because the economics are stronger. When I step on the other side, being 100% renewables, which I think is the future, and the train's left the station in that regard, it is really difficult to find massive scale renewables that make a really strong return. And when I look, we touched a little bit on interest rates at the moment have gone through the roof. Supply chains are struggling and squeezed. These are all short-term problems, but none of the turbine manufacturers have been making a strong return over the last couple of years. So if we step into that world with higher interest rates, higher capital cost, and low energy prices, which is where all the long-term forecasts are sitting, who makes an investment decision to put private capital to work? And so the one debate we haven't had here today is around the cost. So who ultimately pays the cost of this energy transition? Because today, the renewable players aren't making a strong enough return, and they're not going to bear the cost. If we push electricity prices through the roof, then fine, the renewable players make a return, but society pays the cost. And if we find the right balance, then everybody takes a portion. But if there's a huge disconnect between the return that people can get in the market and what society is willing to pay for energy, then governments have to take that cost. And I don't think we spend enough time on who should bear the brunt of the cost of the energy transition.
It's a fascinating point, because fundamentally, if the source of energy that you need to be growing to get us to net zero is basically a worse choice in terms of returns than the energy source that is supposed to be on the downward curve, we've got a fundamental problem, haven't we? And that you've just touched upon.
And I think this is one of the challenges for the policymakers to navigate that effectively, to distribute the return in the right way such that private money makes the right choice. So there is a pathway to do it, but today we have such fractures between each of the different governments to provide that stable framework so that the right return exists in the renewable domain, then the money will flow in and we'll speed up this transition. But to get there, it'd be interesting to hear, to get there is going to be really difficult to find the balance.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just come in on... I think when we look at it, there doesn't have to be a real cost to this transition at all. You know, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel generation. Electric vehicles are cheaper than driving a fossil fuel car. But what we do have is all these different market incentives which don't currently translate that cost to low consumer costs, which I think is what you're pointing to. And then separately, we've got an issue of getting all the right investment into low carbon instead of fossil. I mean, I think just worth noting, we're already exceeding the investment that goes into fossil in what we do in clean energy. And that's through a group of investors who wouldn't typically invest in fossil. It is convincing pension funds to do renewables instead of those kind of things. And I think it's not that we need to get the high returns from renewables necessarily, it's just that it's a completely different type of capital. So if you'd force the match, it might not work. I think that's what you're experiencing. Yep. But if you can attract the stuff that would go into other infrastructure, into low carbon infrastructure, it can be a win-win for a lot of this.
Yeah. I think the challenge today is the return is so small that we're seeing pension funds and others stepping back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the money that is mobile across the industry is going to other places in renewables because the return framework is too small. So I think end of last year was too high a price, too high a return, but where we are this year is too small a return to really attract the capital to work, and there needs to be a stable balance. So you're right, so the right money comes into this.
Yeah.
But the oil and gas versus renewables is a difficult one because they're at completely other ends of the
Yeah, they're
spectrum.
different businesses.
Yeah.
Paul or Karim, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was going to jump in there and say that just remember that electrification is a big component of response, without a doubt. But there's still another component, which is the molecule component. And I think the returns are probably more likely familiar to the oil and gas industry in those industries. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect that's what's going to happen. I want to also make a point about cost. Ultimately, it's me and you who are going to, it's the consumers who are going to pay the cost. Yeah. But the interesting dilemma at the moment is we're already seeing that cost in, the withdrawal of environmental capital. I mean, there is a cost, and this is the whole carbon pricing and emissions trading scheme debate. So it's an interesting one.
The consumer always picks it up.
Yeah, the consumer always pays. And at the moment, they're paying, but they don't even know it.
Okay. Now, Karim, any thoughts from you on
Yeah,
this?
I mean, I think bear in mind that the amount we spend on energy today, which is grid costs, fossil costs, renewable costs, as a percentage of GDP is around 3%. And for 2050, that's actually going to go down to 2% because of economic growth, energy savings, etc. So actually, in the long term, we'll be in a better financial position than we are today. But I take your point that in the short term, when you're looking at these investments of 5-10-year projects, then there can be a problem. That's where perhaps some of the incentives and the policies can come in to bridge the gap in finance that you have to fulfill that and enable those projects to be profitable.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground there, and I think we're basically out of time. And I'd like to thank all of you for a very stimulating 40 minutes discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. So, we're reaching the end of our day here, and I'd now like to welcome Leah back onto the stage for the final panel. Thank you. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Andrew. I found that a really fascinating conversation. There's just so much packed into that panel, just talking about social contract, technology risk, policy risk, and even the threat of companies reneging on their commitments because of all of these things. So I want to get into some of that in the next panel. First, I just want to give you a little bit of background. We're going to be talking about carbon capture and storage, and the way we framed it is breakthrough or basket case. Is CCS fit for purpose as a climate change solution? I think in the view of the public, the jury is still out on that one. So I'd like to hear from the panel. And the International Energy Agency and the United Nations have said that carbon capture, utilization, and storage needs to be part of the solution to limiting climate change. But the IEA more recently has also acknowledged, and this is a quote, "The history of CCUS has largely been one of underperformance." Most of the announced CCUS and hydrogen projects have yet to reach final investment decisions, and the agency suggests that more needs to be done on carbon capture and storage. As announced projects, currently mostly in advanced economies, would provide nearly 40% of what is needed by 2030 in their scenario. So with that background, I'd like to welcome our panelists for the final panel of the day. Please come on up. Julie Krenga from engineering and technology company Technip Energies. Professor John Gibbons from the UK CCS Research Centre. Dr. Chet Bilioc from Petrofac. Alan Baker from Societe Generale. And Panos Mitru from Lloyd's Register. Welcome to all of you. Thank you. So let's start with you, Julie. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, I know Technip Energies is involved in more than 50 carbon capture projects around the world, and you're targeting something like 33 million tons per annum of CO2 capture. Those are really big numbers. And can you just talk us through how many of these projects have made final investment decisions already, and what needs to happen to get the rest over the line?
Sure. I'd like to start by stating that the CCS world is getting very, very busy. So every week you will see in the news some new studies awarded, some new hubs reaching some milestone, etc. So it's happening, maybe not at the speed and at the magnitude that we would like, but there are clear signs that it's happening, it's moving. So coming to our 33 million tons per annum of CO2 that we are contributing to capture through our different projects, we are here simply adding up the quantity of CO2 on all our FEED project and EPC project. And at Technip Energies, we are addressing a very large panel of industries through our Capture Now CCUS platform. So from Blue H2 to some pre-combustion, some post-combustion on various industries, being gas plants or waste to energy. So if you add up all that, you reach this more than 30 million tons per annum. In terms of FIDs, so we have been quoting a lot International Energy Agency today, so I'll do it again. They've said that so far only 5% of all the announced projects have reached FID. So this is what we are seeing today. Most of the projects are now in study phases. But in a way, it's normal because it's a nascent industry. So we don't go directly from nothing to building a mega plant. Okay? So we see a lot of emitters that are now really trying to find what's in it for me. So they look at the various technologies. They try to understand what will be their development plan, because capturing is good, but that you need to offtake your CO2. So what will be my infrastructure? Then they look at financing scheme, etc. And all that takes several years. This is what we observe.
Great, thank you. And how much is cost inflation setting back those timelines around the world with projects? And what are you seeing to be done about this?
Yeah. So cost inflation is affecting everyone, all industries and all infrastructure development. So CCUS is just one among others. So I think what we need to work on is the things that are in our control to mitigate those effects. So first, CCUS has a high cost, and it has a high cost because it's a waste. For now, it's a waste management. So it's an additional cost. So what can we do to mitigate this cost? There are various pathways that the industry is looking at. There is a standardization of the solutions that are being put in place. For example, in carbon capture, modularization is the way to go. Design one, build many. This works well. It's as well working on making this CCUS value chain more fluid, so more partnership, aligning the planets, if I can say, so there is no gaps. It's sharing infrastructure through the hubs, so transportation infrastructure, storage infrastructure. It's as well looking at new business model. We have seen this year Microsoft purchasing carbon credits from CO2 that will be captured at biomass power plants. So this is as well helping the economics. We see some banks that are getting interested as well to look at a scheme on carbon capture as a service. So all that combined, these are all tools that can be deployed to make the economics work better and ultimately progress in the CCUS deployment.
Do you have any thoughts on when it might be actually a profitable business model, CCS for permanent sequestration?
It will become profitable when we recognize that carbon has a cost and has a high cost.
Thank you. Now let's go to John. John, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysts last year published a study of 13 projects involving CCS or CCUS, and it found that 7 underperformed, 2 failed, and 1 was mothballed. That doesn't sound like very good odds so far. You responded by noting the positives in an article for taking those lessons forward. So I wondered if you could describe the biggest engineering and technology challenges you see for industrial CCS at scale, and what are we learning about how you can address the problems?
Yeah, so on that study, particularly the underperforming, a lot of those projects essentially size the equipment for the maximum flow of CO2 that they would get. And we've actually just seen an example published recently of a gas cleanup project in Texas that just never happened to get the volume of gas. So they will always underperform. They won't go at 100% in many cases. They're not designed to. They're not the main function is not CCS. It's taking CO2 out of a gas stream. Okay, so that gets a lot of the hype around it. However, there are some practical issues. Mentioned a lot of projects not getting to FID, and I think the industry and the sponsors have been concentrating on getting to FID and perhaps not thinking enough, and perhaps having a conflict as well with getting to FID, not thinking enough about what happens afterwards. How do we build some margin into the project to mitigate technology risks? You know, trying to get projects over the line in the most competitive way. So I think the biggest risk actually is that people just forget basic engineering and think that FID is the big challenge. In a lot of cases, they're forced, I don't think there's anybody from DESNZ here, but they're forced into a beauty contest that is a bit too ambitious by governments who want to see very low costs of abatement. And if you go in and say, well, actually, really, we should put the cost of this up because it's first of a kind, and we should have a belt braces and maybe a piece of string and maybe a screen to hide behind when our trousers do actually fall down. You know, we should really take this carefully because it is first of a kind, it does matter. And the governments just say, oh, well, no, this is not an issue. You should just go straight ahead and do it. And to some extent, and to get over the FID barrier, industry has gone in saying, no, this is all proven. This is all, perfectly available technology. But it's still first of a kind. So I think that's the big risk. It's not actually the technology itself. It's perfectly doable. You need to put in normal engineering precautions. You need, for example, if you're using amine solvents, which most of the plant projects we're looking at, certainly in the UK, are, to be able to change those. But this isn't rocket science. It's just being aware that things can go wrong and not pretending they can't.
Right, thank you. And now we'll go to Chet. Chet, hi. Cement manufacturing is a great example of a difficult to abate industry and where CCS can actually make a big difference. You recently noted that a cement manufacturing facility in northern England has engaged Petrofac to support its decarbonization ambitions, and you said that would require deploying CO2 capture, and that's inherently necessary because of the CO2 emitted in the extraction process or in the manufacturing process. Mm-hmm. So as you prepare for early phase engineering studies, Could you tell us how much net emissions reduction you expect out of that project? And more broadly, what are the kind of, what do you see as the potential for other CCS projects for cement manufacturers?
Okay, great. So perhaps I'll give some context, then I'll answer your question. So Petrofac, the organization I represent, we are EPCI engineering and construction company. We've been doing that for 40 years, delivering massive energy infrastructure across the world, particularly in the Middle East. So while doing all of that, we've actually developed the early phase engineering capability because we saw that as a way to de-risk projects going forward, helping them go to their stage gates. And also we've also developed operation and maintenance because, again, that helps to make projects better when you are developing them from scratch. So we've been doing this for 40 years. It's based with that context. We actually have been quite busy in energy transition overall, doing offshore wind for 10 years, and we have been very strategic over the last 4 or 5 years in things like CCUS, hydrogen, waste value. So with that context, let me then answer your question. So we've been quite successful at winning lots of CCUS hydrogen engineering projects, and Julia mentioned there are a lot of projects in engineering. We need to ensure that these projects work through the risks. We do the right designs with the risk, then we use the right technology and get them to a place where they cross FID. This plant in particular in Northern England, which touchwood should be a public announcement over the next couple of weeks, they are looking to put a capture plant that will be able to take away about 700,000 tons of CO2 per annum. And to use an analogy, that translates to about depending on the assumptions, you're taking away 350,000 cars off the road. That's something that people use. So what we do see is that because manufacturing cement, getting limestone to cement, there's a release of CO2. Forget whether you are using coal or biomass, whatever you are using, cement itself, if you are it reduces CO2. This is why CCUS is essential for deep decarbonization of cement. So if this project is successful, we help the client connect to services, electricity, wastewater, and all of that. We should be able to take away the amount of CO2 per annum. Then to answer your larger question, so what does this mean overall? So globally, cement, depending on who you talk to, accounts for between 6 or 8% of global emissions. That's a large number, right? If we are successful in implementing CCS on just this plant, it opens the doors for so many others, right? Depending on technology or location and all those other things. And it's not just cement that requires CCUS. People look at waste to energy, a sector that needs CCUS to decarbonize. Even I'll go as far and say the steel industry as a whole, which again has about the same amount of emissions globally as cement. The steel industry, you can use hydrogen or you can implement CCUS. And even if you are using hydrogen, very quickly when you start doing the numbers, you are going down the blue hydrogen route rather than the green hydrogen route. Blue hydrogen means you need CCUS on the hydrogen production capacity, production unit. So what are the potential? Well, CCUS is critical for not just cement, but steel, waste value, and other chemical industries across the world.
Great, thank you. And Alan, we'll go to you next. You've advised on UK CCS projects, and you've led the commercial section of a CCS cost reduction task force. Your company, Societe Generale, has written about the need for an appropriate risk allocation across the CCS value chain. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're innovating with risk allocation for UK industrial clusters, and how might that unlock more funding of CCUS at scale?
Yeah, happy to. In terms of what we're doing at the moment, we're financial advisor to Net Zero Teesside and Northern Endurance Partnership. So that's a power station with CCS, and the infrastructure which takes away the CO2, stores it permanently. We've been involved in UK CCS and, in fact, CCS in general for more than 10 years. So we've had a series of those failed projects or those stalled projects to deal with. But I think now we're at a position where the role of CCS is recognized. We're no longer looking at single projects to develop the business model for CCS. We're looking at clusters, and we're looking at infrastructure which serves those clusters, so it's not point-to-point infrastructure. So we have a very different risk proposition in front of us than we did 5 years ago, for example, to look at the financing, to look at the risk allocation. And now we're involved in a series of negotiations with government around how you allocate those risks between the different parties involved around the table. Some of that's published in terms of the heads of terms of the business models. Some of it is still under negotiation, but I think, you know, systematically what we're trying to do is to work out with those projects, as using those as a template, work out who's best able to take those risks within the stakeholders around the table, whether it's the projects, whether it's the sponsors, whether it's banks, whether it's government ultimately, and have a sort of, you know, a more sensible discussion around how we allocate those risks and indeed what those risks are. I mean, it took quite a while to narrow down the risks, for example, that a project ultimately couldn't take. And it sounds strange when you've got a project sponsored by major oil companies, you know, deep-pocketed utilities, when they say they're not prepared to take a risk, even if the return is very high. But there are some risks like that, so ultimately you need somebody, government in this case, to backstop those risks. But you don't push every risk onto government. You know, the risk project has to take some risk, banks are taking some risk. So we're going through that process now, and ultimately what we hope to end up with are business models or contracts ultimately, which are a template for then replicating through different projects, through different industries, to connect into those clusters by creating the infrastructure. You then enable people to connect to that infrastructure with standardized contracts. And that's where we see the acceleration of the industry then starting to come in. And ultimately, you know, it's a volume business. So when we were looking at point to point, one of the problems we had was that it's actually really expensive to build a pipeline and a storage facility for one single project. And for a cement plant, it's just not possible. It just doesn't work. The economics don't work. If you combine a cluster like Teesside or Humberside or both, or some of the other, Rotterdam, for example, you can accumulate a volume of emissions which starts to reduce the cost of that infrastructure per ton saved. So that's where you can get some of the cost reduction in the industry.
Thank you. And just to follow on to that, we've seen the US, Norway, Netherlands, and UK governments all introducing CCUS incentives, and those include things like tax credits, consumer levies, direct public financing. But just what's the best model? We heard earlier about policy risk and some companies even shying away from the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So who's getting it right and why?
I think the jury's out on that, to be honest. I mean, we're also advising in the US, and I was involved in Northern Lights at the beginning of that project. So, you know, it's difficult for me to choose between them. I think a lot of the development of the regulatory framework, the incentives, the support that government is giving is sort of country specific and industry specific. I mean, Norway has a particular advantage in terms of their existing track record of storing CO2. They don't have a lot of emissions outside of the oil and gas industry within Norway. But what they have got is the ability to ship CO2 in and use that storage experience to create a viable business model. So they become the waste disposal business of emitters in Europe who can't connect to a pipeline, for example. That's one model. The US is interesting. When IRA was published, everybody sort of rushed to the US thinking there was streets paved with gold, money for every that he came up with. It's actually not that straightforward to access that funding, and it comes with strings in terms of local content and various other things, and it comes with policy risk. So while some of the projects are accessing that money, and it is a good trigger to develop CCS projects within the US, it's not necessarily the panacea to the problems that CCS faces. You still have risks to manage risk to deal with. And certainly some of the projects we're working with, whilst they have a very nice subsidy regime which stacks subsidies, they're still talking about the same risks we're talking about here and how you deal with those. And IRA doesn't solve that. It gives you money, it gives you tax benefits, but it doesn't solve the risk.
Okay, great, thank you. And Panos, very interested to hear about another sort of use case for CCUS, and that is onboard carbon capture on ships. And I know you're with Lloyd's Register, and you posted this year about research into that in application. You wrote that the technology readiness is significantly higher than the investment in community readiness, maybe going back to that social contract, as well as the profitability. You also said safety of offloading liquefied CO2 from the carbon capture process still needs to be considered. So can you talk about how these challenges will be overcome for onboard carbon capture and storage?
So, thank you. I will right away come to that, but first of all, since I sense some concern and around the discussion on the CCUS, I would like to share some news, the fact that we have our first order for mid-size CO2 carriers in Korea, a project that was being developed for something more than 2 years. And these will be ships that will be able to carry 22,000 cubes of CO2 at low pressure. This makes that size feasible today. Tomorrow we will see, we are already working in further upscaling that size. But it's very good news, especially in the sense that we start with a project of ships not directly associated to a specific project, but ships that will be open, available to the market, to be employed in the carriage of CO2 globally. So, having said that, evidently, carbon capture represents one more aspect and prospect of decarbonization for shipping. The truth is that as far as capture is concerned, the TRL is high. We don't have an issue there. The main issue comes with storage on board, where we can still store, but the availability of storage is limited on board the ship. And the second key point, which is how do we get rid, how do we dispose that CO2 that is stored on board? I need to note, however, that we see more and more interest, especially coming from ships that will be probably loading at an LNG or an oil terminal, where most probably we will see CO2 infrastructure being developed for carbon capturing reasons during extraction, et cetera, So I think that there will be great prospect there, a Trojan horse to penetrate the shipping sector through LNG carriers, oil tankers, LPG carriers, all these ships, especially those who use cleaner hydrocarbons like LNG and LPG, will have smaller quantities, smaller volumes of CO2 to manage. So I would say that financially, in that case, work quite well, and we have thousands of such ships now. And so CCUS represents a very strong prospect. Evidently, community readiness level refers to the acceptance of CCUS as we speak today, but somebody could perhaps project that this is going to get better, especially on the basis that instead of, let's say, a focus on renewables and the hydrogen and green economy today, we may be moving to a more diversified model with CCUS, nuclear, everything that we can use, because simply energy security reasons and energy austerity will not allow us to reach the decarbonization targets. So as far as investment readiness level is concerned, this is evidently due to the fact that it is only substantially high carbon price that justifies an investment of CCUS. But I I would say that the fact that there are going to be a number of synergies between the large-scale CO2 sector, the large-scale CO2 value chain, and shipping, like, for example, debunkering of CO2 from ships and the development of CO2 infrastructure in ports and hubs. I see that that aspect will also be tackled in the years to come, so at least we will bridge part of the gap that we have today in the use of CCUS on board in comparison with other alternative fuels.
Great, thank you. And a question came in from the audience. I'll put this out there and let me know if any of you want to take this one. Why are we seeing the CO2 as a cost and not as a material to be used in a circular economy? This should help generating money and consequently reaching more easily FID. John?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a guy called, I think it was Chuck Collin in the US in about 2010, and it goes back to the failure of Obama to get a proper energy bill through. So the stimulus fund that Obama set up put a lot of capital in for CCS, but it didn't actually end up providing revenue support. And this guy said, oh, well, what we should do is sell the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And he said, I'm the man who put the U in CCUS. And in a sense, he was right. You could sell CO2 for a bit of money, but it's nowhere near enough to actually finance projects. It's there. But that's actually a fairly unique utilization, because despite what people say about, oh, you get extra oil out the ground, oil is not CO2. You do put CO2 in the ground and it does stay there permanently. So it's actually storage. But we've then got another strand of things, which is the ersatz economy out of Germany, essentially. And Germany, under a bit of stimulus from the Royal Navy, spent a lot of time trying to make things out of waste, essentially. And they would use carbon in carbon dioxide, and they're still looking at using carbon in carbon dioxide, because it's there and they can do it, and they don't really have enough carbon of their own. But unlike the US example, the German example, where you use CO2 to, say, make liquid fuels, just ends up releasing it into the atmosphere. And we've had a long conversation, a number of academics, with the EU Commission in the past, about saying, look, this is just a unique way, or a novel way of releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. It won't get you to net zero. And I can remember the people from the Commission just said, la, we don't care. This CO2 was going to be released anyway. It's good for the economy. We want to find a use for green hydrogen that actually does something. So the problem is, yes, you can get paid for it if you've got no better alternative. Yeah. But in most cases you do. You've got fossil fuels still. We're not running out, unless you're in a constrained economy with a strong green tendency. But you won't get to net zero. And if you're serious about net zero, pretty quickly you realize there's nothing that can use that much CO2 and give you net zero.
Thanks. And Chet, just actually before I come to that, I just wanted to add on to that I think that's a tricky area, because enhanced oil recovery, if you're talking about end user emissions as well, how do you...
there's a I don't know what you call it, confabulation, but just a basic problem that, we work on a system that monitors CO2 emissions as CO2 emissions. We could work on a system that monitored carbon where it comes out the ground, but don't mix the two up, okay? You can play all sorts of games about what happens with extra oil that gets produced when I'm using enhanced oil recovery, but they're games. The fact is, does the carbon stay in the ground? And as it happens with enhanced oil recovery, because of the solubility of CO2 in the oil, it does stay in the ground. And that's really what matters.
Great. Thanks. Chet?
So let me address the question about you. So, in a previous life, I was an academic, and when I looked at that, one paper I came out with Nature was that if you try to use the CO2 that is emitted, you will be lucky if we get to 5% that is currently there. So there's just not enough use cases for the CO2 to be valuable. And majority of that 5%, as John said, will go into enhanced recovery, which is why CCUS has been operational in the US for over 40 years now, because there's a value in that CO2, which then goes into enhanced oil recovery to produce more oil. Now, on the Petrofac side, I guess the question is, we just got awarded ADNOC carbon capture for Habshan, which, again, one of the few projects that has crossed FID recently. We are very proud of that. We have a very strong track record, as I said, in the Middle East in delivering energy infrastructure. The interesting thing about the UAE is that they've been doing CCUS for a few years now. They've been capturing CO2 from a steel facility which they inject in one of their ADNOC's depleted oil and gas fields. And although ADNOC has stated that they do plan to use captured CO2 for some enhanced oil recovery, for the Habshan project in particular, they have not said that. They said they are going to store this CO2 in one of their depleted oil and gas fields. It's called Babs, far north, if I recall it correctly. And then they want also trial other storage mechanisms like CO2 mineralization or storing in something called deep saline aquifers. I don't want to go too technical in that, but it's just a different storage mechanism. So to summarize, one thing that this utilization or EOR, it can throw a bit of confusion, but one company that I know for sure is looking into storage at EOR is Occidental Petroleum. And I've heard Vicky Hello speak about it a few times. She has said that, and again, I've looked at it in the past, that what they do plan to do is use CO2, yes, to produce more oil, but the idea behind they can operate their EOR process in a way to store 4 times the CO2. They produce one barrel of oil, but they can store 4 times of that CO2 within the ground. So at the end of the day, you are storing more CO2 and producing less oil.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. So, from my perspective, EOR is not.
Can you hear? Sorry, just 1 second. Can you hear?
Yeah.
No? Pranjal, do you have the mic? Sorry about that. Something happened with your mic.
Sorry about it. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. It's better. Maybe it's me. So let's talk about true utilization of CO2, because EOR, I don't think it's a solution we want to promote moving forward. So there are many ways to use the CO2, not in a very large quantity. You're right, Chet. Unfortunately, we are emitting too much CO2 to utilize it. But some of it can be utilized to produce some low carbon product. So combining it with green hydrogen, we can make a certain number of derivatives, such as e-methanol and others. As well, look at low carbon material for construction, like aggregates and so on. We can use it on develop new type of plastic for shoes or so. So there are many applications. And obviously, sustainable aviation fuel as well. So all that is, most of it is not fully mature yet, or the economics are not there compared to traditional product. But these are things that are progressing quite fast. And at Technip Energies, we are very hopeful that these are new markets that will become sustainable in the future.
That's great, thank you. Chet? Oh, sorry. No.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, just a very quick one. You can call methanol made with captured CO2 low carbon, but only properly if the CO2 came from the air. Yeah. This is the game that, as I say, the EU commissioner who we tried to educate was playing. Now, okay, you could say, well, I'm using the CO2 twice, but then you've got to have a debate with whoever you capture the CO2 from, say, well, you can't claim this because I'm emitting it. Or, you can play games, but honestly, the idea, everybody's saying, oh, I've got low carbon methanol made with captured CO2. You could have put that CO2 underground and actually seen some real benefit. All you're doing is releasing it, and incidentally, using some really expensive green hydrogen that could have gone for something else, possibly saving even more CO2. So there's a whole industry that might come with direct air capture, and I believe you can buy trainers now made from CO2 capture from the air. But that's a different thing. That isn't really. It's neither net zero. Well, it's net zero in effect, but it isn't really CCS. It's just getting a raw material to play an expensive game. But as I say, if you're making methanol with most CO2 you capture, it's only low carbon if you play a game with whoever you were capturing the CO2 from.
Great, thank you.
Unless you want to respond on it.
John, let me just add to that. Yes, the CO2 from DAC, fantastic, but also there's CO2 from BECCS, which is from a biomass source, which again, it's fossil.
But as I say, you could have just just as well put it underground
negative emission
and use something else. I mean, it doesn't really help.
So finally, we're running out of time here. I just wanted to go to Alan and just ask a final question here with a brief answer, but it's a big question though. Is CCS fit for purpose in the climate change battle today, or does more have to be done to improve the technologies and bring down the costs?
I guess we'll find out. I mean, one of the problems is, to be honest, and we're looking at financing projects now as we speak, obviously, and one of the problems is we haven't got a good project to point to say, this is what we're building and this works.
Yep.
So there's a bit of a leap of faith. There's a lot of due diligence. There's a lot of sort of contingency and managing risk to try to get one project financed, one project operating that gives the finance community confidence enough to start investing in the industry overall. And talking about mobilizing capital, in the last session, I think, you won't mobilize the type of capital we need for this industry unless you can get one project financed. And we saw it in offshore wind, we saw it in various new industries previously. You need to demonstrate that something works. You need to get banks familiar with it. You need to show them that there is an industry there that they can finance, and then suddenly things start to take off.
Great.
Going back to the e-fuels point, we are working on a direct air capture project. It's creating e-fuels, and the one benefit of being in the States is that there are a huge amount of subsidy available.
Yep. And that's what Vicky Hollop's getting with that here.
It's really expensive. It'll come down in cost for sure, but at the moment it's really expensive if you're capturing the CO2 from the air, producing green hydrogen, and then combining to make a fuel which is relatively cheap at the moment.
Great.
So.
Thank you so much. And we'll have to leave it there, but I want to thank all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion on carbon capture and storage, and more to come. I guess we'll be watching to see how this develops and how we get from ambition to actual projects starting up. Thank you very much, and thank you. So finally, we've concluded all the panel discussions for the day, so I'll hand over to Andrew Lee to return to the stage to deliver the closing remarks, and thank you all.
Well, there we go. Thank you, everyone. We reached the end of our day. I think it's been a terrifically stimulating day here. What have we heard? I think perhaps the biggest lesson we can take away is that this energy transition business is a tough cookie to crack. We heard this morning the cost of not moving fast enough, catastrophic climate events, the cost of moving too fast. Well, that could be, people have said, the collapse of the social order. So those are pretty big stakes at both ends of the equation. We've heard a lot about the need to take people with the transition, the need to make it affordable for people. What are we going to get from COP in a few weeks? Who knows? but I'm going to take the liberty to say that what we need to see is leadership. And that's what the world needs on these issues. Whether we'll see it or not remains to be seen. But we've had, I think you'll all agree, a stimulating day together. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank our sponsors there, without whom we wouldn't be here. I'd like to thank all the panelists and speakers. I'd like to thank the team from DN Media Group who put this event together so expertly. I'd like to thank Leah for co-hosting it. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us upstairs for some welcome refreshments to end the day and maybe continue the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.